one American researcher and writer has been studying human origins for decades, and he points out something very, very interesting. He says that the human DNA has more than 4,000 defects compared with only a few hundred in chimpanzees and gorillas. And here's a key point I want to make. Mainstream science has acknowledged sudden changes in human genetics about 200,000 years ago and again 35,000 years ago. A lot of people believe that at one time the humans may have had 12 or 13 strands of DNA, and now we only have 2 strands of DNA. But what were these changes in human genetics? What was that all about? Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of things here. Mankind, or the beings on this planet, were doing just fine up until their DNA got changed by somebody or some organization or something. So just exactly what happened here is kind of interesting. Now we do know that Enki and Enlil were involved with genetic engineering to create humankind in the first place, but we also know that today there's a bunch of shape-shifting hybrid human reptilians that have shape-shifting capability that can look like real human beings right on the street, yet they can shapeshift into horribly nasty reptilians with a very carnivorous appetite. And they're very intelligent. And how did they come about? How did they wind up here being on the earth? Well, that could have happened during the period of 200,000 years ago or 35,000 years ago when we had another alteration on the earth. Now, there was some researchers have thought that maybe the Nordics came in because a number of the shape-shifting humans also have blonde hair and blue eyes, and that's kind of the way the Nordics are, and that they are working with the reptilians behind the scenes trying to control our planet. The biggest problem that we have with DNA manipulation is DNA, as I mentioned before, was used to communicate the background hologram through the 5 senses of man and have the mind convert what they think the holographic reality is to their mind. Well, when this big event came in and the human DNA was altered, there's actually a text that refers to that in the Bible, and it's all over the world. There's many historical documents that show what happened, and in the Bible it talks about the Tower of Babel is one of the most famous stories where the gods came in and they changed the language of human beings so they could no longer communicate with each other. Well, that's all over. That's not just the Tower of Babel story. It's everywhere. Writings all around the world that the human languages got scrambled. Well, how did the human languages get scrambled? Well, the way the languages got scrambled was the DNA got scrambled. Okay, and this is most interesting. The scrambling of the original language involved rewriting the language blueprint within the junk or non-coding DNA. All right, so before I mentioned that a lot of people, and we're told on TV that DNA is all about genes, and if you get if you get the genes from your parents, if your parents have a problem like some disease, you're going to get the same thing, all because of the DNA, because it's genetic only. But there's a lot of researchers that say we have just tons and tons and tons of what they call junk DNA that serves no purpose whatsoever in our DNA. Well, the truth of the matter is it's the junk DNA that communicates the language, which translates the hologram into what we see as our reality. So, all spoken and written languages that followed from this new blueprint are now operating on a different frequency to the high vibrational global language that went on before, and was over all the previous communication was overwhelmingly telepathic. The new frequency generated by every spoken and written word in all the languages, the same waveform blueprint, is being decoded by DNA to form a feedback loop. The DNA language blueprint generates the language, which is broadcast by vocal cords and by the written word. Now it really gets interesting. Well, how do they do this? How does the junk DNA, how is that being used for language? Well, this is very interesting. The Chinese I Ching, or the Book of Changes, actually relates to the human genetic code, which is why I Ching, if anybody's ever studied Chinese languages and I Ching and this sort of thing, I Ching has 64 hexagrams, or kua, and that ties in with our genetic code, our new genetic code, our altered genetic code, which has 64 codons, which are the basic building blocks from which all physical, quote-unquote physical, life is said to manifest. Well, we now know that it's holographic life, but the language of the I Ching perfectly matches the change in genetic code, so you have perfect harmony to the new language and the codons in our junk DNA. There are many other confirmations that have been identified by researchers and experts to connect the I Ching to DNA sequencing, and it confirms that the ancient Chinese, or whoever it was that gave them I Ching codes, had a complete understanding of DNA with the potential to manipulate the DNA. China, of course, is closely associated with the serpent or dragon gods, the Archon reptilians. Now, when I talk about the Archon reptilians, I'm bringing up a new subject that I was just starting to get into last week. How do we know about the Archon reptilians? Well, what's very interesting about the Archons, there was a group, many people that have actually studied, trying to find out the truth, maybe studied the Bible, did some Bible studies and that sort of thing, have come across the group of people known as the Essenes, a group of Gnostics that lived in the early centuries of the first millennium after Christ died, and it talks about them living out in Qumran and out in the distance. And when you hear about the Gnostics, all you hear is about the Essenes. Well, what's very interesting is what's not given very honorable mention is the fact that there was another group of Gnostics that had nothing to do with the Christian Gnostics, and they were called the pagan Gnostics. And they also were doing their own thing at the same time the Christians were, so the society, all the scholars have done a really good job in making the reality of the pagan Gnostic information kind of disappear under the table, but there's enough researchers out there that have translated their writings, and what they found was the pagan Gnostics wrote extensively about the Archons. And who are the Archons? Well, they said that the Archons are aliens on this planet that have come here to manipulate the DNA and throw everything off so people can't understand what the truth is. They alter our DNA and perception of reality. And the Archons, they said that the two main groups of Archons are the ones that created humankind using DNA, which Claudia can tell us more about. And the other group is the Greys, the same kind of Greys that were found on the Roswell, New Mexico crash. These Greys are the ones that go around and work with the reptilians, and they go into people's homes at night and and take women out of their beds and take them off to some ship somewhere and do all sorts of DNA alterations on them and put them back and erase their memory, and 3 months later the woman realized, hey, I'm pregnant and I haven't had any relations. Well, that's the Greys and the Archons working behind the scenes to continue altering DNA and working with the DNA changes that they've been doing. So they wrote extensively about that, and I went online a couple of days ago trying to find more information, and all I can, the original information is so distorted by the writers that write about it. They're written by the Christian or Jewish communities, and they altered it just to hide the true facts of it. But the real researchers that have done it, the ones that actually were seeking the truth, have written extensively about it, and that's how David Icke became aware of it. And it's very interesting how these archons have come in and changed the languages. So where does all this get us? All right, so we know that the DNA has been seriously altered. We know that our history goes back a lot farther than mainstream science would have us. By the way, I was going to mention that you have the mainstream science actually acknowledges that you had these changes in human genetics at 200,000 years ago, and again 35,000 years ago. There was a tablet that was found that was called the Sumerian King List. And the Sumerian King List went back 240,000 years, and one of the kings ruled on Earth for 36,000 years, just one single king by himself, and that was all taking place. So there's a lot of stuff going on this planet. So the next thing I want to point out is, well, now that we know that our DNA, well, let me recap here. We're living in a holographic universe that was created, quote unquote, created by God, when He created the heavens and the earth, and everything was fine at the time. But somehow or another, at least in our part of the solar system, somebody came in and supplanted and changed our DNA. Well, the problem with that is our DNA is used to translate the information from the background holographic universe into our brain, where our brain translates that information into the reality of the illusion, so we can experience this illusion the way that we came here to experience it. Well, so far so good, but then all of a sudden, whether it was 200,000 years ago or 35,000 years ago or whenever it was, and maybe these times are way off. It could have happened way before then. I'm just pointing the ones that are in mainstream science, and they're not always exactly 100%, which I'm sure you all know. Well, anyway, at some point in time, our DNA got altered. So what happens when our DNA gets altered? All of a sudden, our clear view of cause-effect creation gets blurred. All of a sudden, we're looking through a prism, or we're looking through a glass window that's no longer clear, where the glass is distorted and maybe cracked in places where you're not getting the full picture. You're only seeing fragments of the picture, and you're not getting the clear picture anymore. So this is the reason why, when we go on the real side, we get a clear view of what's going on. When we're looking at things from the creative side, we can't see the full picture. That's and that's why a lot of things don't make sense in this reality that we're living in. Well, anyway, here's the next step of what I'm going to say here is one of the things that happened. And if you go back and do research, there was a Russian scientist that years ago, his name was Immanuel Velikovsky, and he did a big study of event changes that happened on planet Earth and throughout our solar system, and he discovered that just in recent times, within maybe the last tens of thousands of years, we've had some major events going on within our solar system and maybe even neighboring solar systems. And planets have been collided with. We know that Mars was virtually destroyed. We know there's an asteroid belt out there and a whole bunch of other things that have taken place. And one thing I saw I was watching a TV special, a National Geographic special, I think it was, where they were talking about Enki and Enlil. And Enki was the chief architect behind the creating of human beings. And one of the interesting things about that was, according to this program, I don't know how true it is, and maybe Claudia, you could comment on this. On this program, it said that at a point in time, Enki built up this kingdom, and he was making all the profit and all the money from it and everything. And Enlil, his brother Enlil, got really jealous, and he decided that he had enough of Enki, and he came in, and he was one of the principals involved in wreaking havoc within our solar system. And he even went on to so far as the old story goes, it was Enki that warned Noah, whoever that might have been, the person of Noah, to build an ark and get ready for a huge flood on this planet. And now researchers know it was a historical fact that the Earth was widely flooded, whether it was, I doubt if it was from rain or the deeps opening, but I think it had a lot more to do with the pole shift, where the crust of the Earth got twisted through some sort of dynamic forces, and the water from the oceans overflowed the mainlands, and I think that was one of the major causes of flooding. And but anyway, this article on TV said that Enki's brother Enlil was responsible for this, and it created widespread, really widespread damage to the Earth.